this episode of The Scorekeepers, join me, your host Daniel Farrell, as I speak with composer Andrew Morgan Smith. Andrew is a composer for film and television, and most recently he brought his expertise to The Old Way, starring Nicolas Cage. The film follows an old gunslinger and his daughter as they are forced to face the consequences of his past when the son of a man he murdered years ago arrives to take his revenge. Andrew has worked on close to 100 projects covering a variety of genres and styles, and I'm super excited to hear how he approached scoring the old way. Welcome to The Scorekeepers. Welcome to the show, Andrew. It's amazing to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, man. I appreciate it.
Before we dive on into your work, I'd love if you could just give the audience a brief overview of who you are and what you do.
So my name is Andrew Morgan Smith, and I'm a film and television composer, and I scored The Old Way, which is what I wanted to talk today about, which is, I don't know, I'm excited about it, so that's good.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great film. I enjoyed watching it and listening to the music. So how did you get your start in music? Did you play music in school growing up?
Yeah, I started taking piano lessons in first grade, and then from there I picked up guitar. My dad played guitar, as well as he played tuba. So at a certain point, I also picked up saxophone, and then I kind of jack of all trades did the whole way up. You know, it was in high school I kind of picked up some brass instruments, and I kind of picked up random stuff, and then in college, the orchestra director figured out that I could play bass, and he's like, well, if you can play electric bass, you could also play upright bass, because they needed bass players. So I ended up, playing bass for, I guess, 2.5 or 3 years in the orchestra in college. And, that was kind of my musical start, coming from like a musical background. Both my sisters and I all took piano lessons in school. My dad, who was a music major, who eventually became a lawyer, who did the smart thing, I guess. He thought it was important that if we ever wanted to do anything musically, it was good to have a foundation, to go from there.
So obviously you spent a lot of time playing a ton of different instruments. I feel like a lot of composers, that's something they gravitate towards. They just want to learn all the different instruments, all the different ways in which you can make music. But what drew you in specifically to pursue composing for media and film?
From a very young age, I remember one of my earliest like musical childhood memories was having this cassette tape that was of the Boston Pops in Space. It was called Pops in Space, and it was like I very vividly remember this cassette tape that had this like UFO on it with, it was like this orchestra inside of a glass UFO, glass UFO top. And that I remember listening to that score, like that, not that score, but it was a recording of a bunch of scores that John Williams conducted with the Boston Pops. And I remember very vividly listening to that a ton, even though I hadn't seen all the movies that were recorded. I remember listening to it a ton. I loved film music growing up. I would always listen to it. My dad would put it on, the stereo, we'd listen to it, but I never really saw it as a career until I got to high school and I saw the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie, and I watched it, I don't know, 7 times in theaters. And for some reason, that movie's score really stuck in my head. Just for whatever reason, it didn't really strike me as a career until that point. And then from that point forward, that was what I wanted to do, right? Like all my efforts wanted to go in that direction. That was the genesis of me wanting to do that. It's just, it's weird. It's just sometimes things don't strike you until some random moment that it feels like a switch flipped,
And after that, did you go to college to like study composition?
The college I went to, which is in my hometown, which is the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, has a what they call a music media program, which has a film scoring component. It's more like music production. And I decided, you know what? The composition side, I had gone and talked to the comp teacher, and I had gone and talked to the music media head. And after talking to them, it seemed like the production side was was very important, obviously, as we as I know now, looking back on it. But I decided to go into music media just to learn more on the production side. And the comp teacher had told me, like, we can do lessons. You can always work with me. Like, you don't have to be in the comp department. It was one of the advantages of going to a smaller school, right? Is that I had the ability, like, everyone kind of knew who I was because it's a relatively small school. And if you're motivated, they'll do a lot to help you out because they have time, because there's not 40 other students that are trying to share the time, So I ended up going there, and I ended up double majoring anyway. I think that there was something like 5 classes difference between the 2 degrees. So I ended up going there and double majoring by the end of it anyway. So I got a double concentration in composition and music media. The time I had in college, I think, was valuable. It's like a valuable, I guess, semi-professional incubator. You know what I mean? Like, you get to kind of say, you can reach out to professionals, and which I did. I wanted to go to USC, to their film scoring program, so badly. Like, I reached out. I was probably psychotic. I reached out to students and I would like pick their brains on like, hey, how do you do this? How do you do that? I want to do this. I want to do that. I reached out to USC and I said, hey, your website says you need a comp degree or equivalent professional experience to go to the program. Like, what is equivalent professional experience? So they said, oh, you could go to this music festival in Aspen that has for the Aspen Music Festival, they had a film scoring portion at the time. They don't have it anymore. Or you could attend one of these other workshops with ASCAP. And so then every year, that's what I applied to. Every year I'd go apply to that. And I ended up taking correspondence lessons with one of the comp teachers at USC as well. So like I would, I would make a CD of a recording, print out the score, send it to him. He'd mark it up, he'd send it back with notes, which was great. It was a great experience. And so he ended up being one of the teachers at the Aspen Music Festival as well. So finally, like my last semester, I got into the Aspen Music Festival, me and 5 other students. You go and do a crash course in film scoring for a month. And I studied with Jeff Rona and David Newman and Jack Smalley, who was the teacher I was doing correspondence lessons with. Like, that was kind of my educational hurrah, I ended up not going to USC, but I came back from the Aspen Music Festival and ended up getting my first, we'll say, real movie job. I had done other stuff before that, but my first real commercial film I got right after I came back while I was finishing school.
And at what point did you transition over to be in LA and working the movie composing gig?
Well, so my first real movie actually just happened to be through a company that was local. So there still is, but at the time they've now like restructured a lot, but there were tax credits in Louisiana, and there still are. There are film tax credits. I'm sure we've all heard a lot about them. They're in Georgia. They're all over the place, but Louisiana's was kind of a big splash at the time. This would be 2011 or so. And actually, yeah, like 2011-ish. And they had this company in town who was shooting sci-fi TV movies. That was what they were doing. All the Sharknadoes and all that kind of stuff, right? So they were shooting in town, and I took my demo CD at the time, which consisted of, I had done one feature film at that point, which was for somebody locally. I'd done a bunch of promo videos, and I had also done some commercial work. And then at the Aspen Music Festival, we actually did record with a live orchestra there. So I had all this, my demo CD with my information on it, and I brought it over to their production office in town. And I go in there and there's nobody in there. There's like an assistant in the office, and I go in there and I didn't know any better, and this office completely empty. And I'm like, hey, I'm a composer. Here's my demo. He's like, okay, thanks. And then I walk out and I just fully thought like, okay, well, that's it. Like this.
That assistant was probably so confused.
Yeah. Like, this guy doesn't, I just thought to myself, like, I don't know who, like, that guy probably, and in hindsight, even more so, I'm like, the guy probably didn't even know what to do with it, just some assistant. So I'm in a college, I'm in my last semester of college. I'm sitting in class and I get a call from a number that I don't recognize. It's an LA number though. And I check my voicemail after class, and it's the director of this movie, and he's like, "Hey, I just picked up your CD with a bunch of stuff off a desk, and I happened to have it in my car, and I saw it, and I put it in my CD player, and I really like it. You want to come and talk to us about maybe scoring a movie?" And that was how I got my first job. I auditioned, and I got the job of like, this is my first real, that's what I said, like my first real gig, right? Where you're not doing a favor for some
Right.
buddy of yours. Like, this person doesn't know you. They don't have a problem telling you no, you know? Yeah, that was, and I done a ton of work for those guys over the years. They're really thankful for that opportunity. And that was my real, like, first foray into this job,
Man, if only CDs were like still hardcore, I would just leave them everywhere.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's yeah, that's what I mean by it's now looking back on it, I'm just like, geez, man. Like the fact that guy just, I mean, like any other thing, everybody has like sort of, oh, you were at the right place at the right time and the right thing happened, you know. I mean, that was what it was, There's no other way to put that, divine intervention, I guess,
Yeah, I mean, you've had such a prolific career so far, I think, with close to 100 projects under your belt. But your latest film, which is The Old Way, directed by Brett Donahue and starring Nicolas Cage, is particularly amazing. I enjoyed watching it, and I'm really excited to talk to you about this project. So, first, how did you come to work on this film? What was the partnership process like of working on this?
So what it was I happened to know two of the producers really well on this movie, one of which I've done a lot of work for in the past, and the other who's just a good friend of mine who I talk to pretty regularly. And I got a call from them one day, and they said, "Hey, we're going up to help on this movie that's shooting in Montana. It's starring Nicolas Cage." And they're like, "Would you be interested in scoring it?" I'm like, well, yeah. you know so I had shown interest early on, and they said, we were thinking about doing a pretty guitar based score. Like, that's where the initial talks were, of like, we're thinking guitars, we're thinking like kind of more modern westerns. Like, cool, like that sounds fine to me. So they go up there, they shoot the movie, goes off fine, and we get to the edit, and they sent me a little bit of it, and they had been talking a little bit at that point of like, this isn't really working. Like the music, just the temp music, which they had, just really wasn't quite working right. It at the time was like very guitar based, and some things worked really well. And that the movie is a very intimate movie, right? It's this father-daughter story of like them kind of growing in their relationship. So for all the more intimate stuff, the guitar stuff was fine, but it really didn't give scope. So whenever, they shot in Montana, it gives you all this built-in production value, and they cut to some huge shot, of them walking across this field or whatever. And then you see these huge mountains, and the guitar is just kind of plucking away, and it just doesn't feel big enough, right? Like it
feels really tiny.
It doesn't give the scope to the movie in a movie that really felt like it needed more scope. So at that point, we started talking about, well, what can we do? Like, what could we do? And we started to talk about this more like classic studio Western vibe. So that became the pitch, was what if we did something that felt a little more, still had like the throwback feel of the movie, because it is a little bit of a throwback movie. It's not one of these super gritty Westerns. It is more of a classic studio vibe. There's a bit of optimism to it. It's not, we're not setting out here to paint with a realistic brush, right, so to speak. So we needed to go in that direction. So I took the first sequence they sent me, which was the opening scene of the movie where there's a huge gun battle. And I actually, after kind of searching a little bit, I got excited and actually wrote almost exactly what's there in the film right now.
Wow.
Even though it wasn't locked, I'd had this idea kind of banging around in my head of, what if I took Rocky Mountain folk music and I kind of merged it with orchestra? So we get kind of the good parts of what the guitar stuff brought, and the fiddle stuff and banjo and everything. And then also on the other hand, we also get the scope that we get with the large orchestra stuff. So that was my pitch. Was I wrote this, I don't even remember how long the first version of it was, but I wrote that, sent it off to the producers. They showed it to the director, Brett, and Brett loved it. So I think that kind of like cinched the job for me. Was, hey, like, let's do this this way. Like, this is my take on that tone.
It's interesting you talk about how it's a kind of a callback movie to that older style of westerns, of cowboy movies. It's interesting just the title itself, The Old Way. It's almost like a double meaning of that's what they're going for. It's kind of a classic homage. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your inspirations from classic Western film scores and how you were drawing upon that, but making it new in a sense.
It feels in a lot of ways something that could be pulled a lot from like True Grit, right? Like some John Wayne movie from another time. And also another thing that drew me to the part as well is, I'd say to the job, to the movie, to the job. The other thing that drew me to it was Nicolas Cage does not play Nicolas Cage. Right. Like that. He's definitely playing against his type, which I thought was really interesting. And I was excited about, because it's just, Nicolas Cage is great. I have no problem with Nicolas Cage. I think he does awesome work, but I was excited that he was doing something different, right? He was given the chance to do something different and kind of flexing a different muscle. And there was also some other stuff we can kind of talk about. I actually kind of went a little bit back a little further than the traditional Westerns a little bit. I listened to a lot of Copeland on some of this.
I was going to say, there was like, I could feel the rodeo.
Yeah, exactly. Like, which I know that it's almost like going back to the source material of those Westerns, right? Like that was kind of my thought process. I wanted it to be more in the rodeo world versus like, oh, that's a copy of the Magnificent Seven, you know? And I did listen to a few more modern scores just to see, okay, what are other people doing kind of in this same world? But then once I kind of came upon, because we specifically said we didn't want spaghetti Western. Like we didn't want we didn't want people to watch it and go, okay, good, bad, and ugly. All right, cool. Because I think that also is a little bit more of the DNA of what the more modern scores are anyway. So I ended up kind of going back to the original, the original open Western sound. And then once I came upon the idea of the folk music thing, I think that really is what cinched kind of what I was going to do, which is I used a lot of the open fifths and fourths and everything that you'd get on like a drone violin or drone fiddle. And I extrapolated that to the orchestra. So like there are times when you're playing like the orchestra and the violins are playing the same kind of rhythms or same kind of ideas as what the fiddle is playing, and kind of pulling from that as well and using that to inspire the sound. And then obviously I use a lot of processing on the banjo and on the fiddle throughout the movie. So those are kind of elements that help modernize it. So it has still that old vibe with taking the inspiration from Copeland, but then updating the sound a bit with it being a little more processed in certain ways. So like the orchestra is pretty much normal. Like the orchestra is not processed, but as you go through the movie, you get, delays on banjos, on guitars, on fiddles, like a little bit of the more intimate stuff has some processing on it,
It's so cool talking about the aspect of the folk music that you brought into it, because what really struck out to me when I was watching and listening was the use of the banjo in the score, especially towards the start with the walking to school and the jelly bean, and a little bit later on, a lot of times with the character of the young girl. Can you talk about the process of choosing banjo as kind of the instrument of choice in the score, and what it was like working with Seth Taylor as the performer on the banjo?
The banjo was one of the things that really worked in the original temp music. It had this character to it, which I think really was valuable, which part of what's so interesting about this movie is that it kind of touches on the idea of what being on the spectrum in the late 1800s would be like. What does that even mean to somebody? Because they just don't in the film that they just don't relate to each other like other people relate to each other, and they have to kind of figure out how they do that. And so you kind of have to fill in the blank emotionally, musically, right? It's not that they're devoid of emotion, it's just different. So the way I kind of went about that, the thing that I liked about the banjo was that it had this curiosity to it. Like it could have this calculating experience, but so whenever she's doing the jelly beans, for instance, it's very metronomic at first. And then as she gets into it, it becomes a little more light. It becomes a little more happy. She's obviously very focused on what she's doing and she's getting a lot of value out of what she's doing. So there was this innate curiosity that kind of went along with the theme that I created, where it just felt, it had this liltingness still to it, which I think was what we needed, because especially there's a lot of levity in the movie.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I mean, not unfortunately, it's not unfortunate. It's just because the characters are supposed to be a little bit on the spectrum, you have to kind of fill in the blanks musically a little bit, if that makes sense. Because there's a bunch of things of this retired gunman who he just is annoyed by everybody around him. And his daughter is walking to school asking him. So we're like asking him all these questions. We're juxtapositioning, the juxtaposition of like, oh, this is this ruthless killer, and now he's being pestered by his kid, just like everybody else is, Or he's dealing with a customer at the store who's asking him a million questions, and he's probably thinking, 20 years ago, you'd be dead on the floor, So the banjo really played into that emotion well, especially since a lot of more monophonic instruments would tend to be a little more connected, a little more lyrical. And working with Seth was great. Seth Taylor, the banjo player, he was actually the person who I met through the fiddle player, who is also one of my close friends and collaborators, Steve Reese. And he just did an awesome job. Like if I wrote something, which I was excited, you don't get to write action banjo that much,
Yeah. It does not show up very often.
It's not something you should hear. Oh, let's do action banjo, guys. How about that on this one? But like I could send him, here's this motion. And I just would generally tell him, like, do what you can, but like make it more idiomatic for whatever it is. Like if it's not working, feel free to make it work. Like I'm not going to be hurt if the arpeggiation doesn't work that way. Like it's mostly just emotion that's the important part. It's not necessarily the exact notes. So he was great for that. And he also recorded guitar on the score for me, so it was tremendously valuable to have somebody at the table who could just, like telepathy. I could just say, hey, here's what I'm thinking. What do you think?
Right. It's so helpful when some of the performers can interpret your ideas, like get to the source of what you were trying to get at.
Yeah.
And perform it the way that you hope it would be performed.
And that's how I am with Steve, the fiddle player. I mean, he actually was on that first movie I was referring to that I got with my random demo CD. He's been on a ton of stuff with me, but he knows, when I send him something, I'm like, hey, can you improvise over this, or can you do this? He knows exactly what I'm asking for. There's I don't have to hold his hand while he does it, which is great.
So you had some really kind of cool and interesting behind the scenes videos. And I'm sure we'll have in the description for people to watch of the recording sessions that you were doing. So you had the Budapest Symphony Orchestra that you were recording remotely, and then a few are Seth local? Are the local to you? Were you recording them or?
They're in Nashville.
Okay.
And actually, like obviously we had to do their stuff music video style, so all their stuff was done in post, because they actually just recorded in their home studios. So I would send some to Steve, we just had a shared Dropbox. He'd send stuff back to me, I'd send stuff to Seth, he'd send stuff back to me. It was all, and I mean the engineer is in Berlin, the orchestrator is in Michigan, it's a fully international process.
I wanted to know what because this must have been like a crazy thing to manage with people just all over the place and pulling the score together from so many different places. What was it like doing that?
I mean, I don't, I feel like it was pretty much the same as we would do anywhere else, right? Like if someone's in Burbank and someone's in Santa Monica, and so, I mean, no one's getting out in LA traffic to go, hey, let me go get a hard drive, right? Everyone's sending links and doing all this stuff. You work on, whatever show, they're sending you a download link. They're not sending a runner to go send you a hard drive. So, in some ways, it didn't really change anything. I mean, obviously, if I could have been in the room for some of the recordings, that would have been great. There's always a little bit of like, well, it'd be cool to do this and be in the same space, and then you could audition ideas, especially with the fiddle player and the banjo player. Like that's a little bit of, okay, that'd be nice to do in person. But generally, I mean, I felt like it was pretty painless, pretty painless relatively. And actually in some ways, like the fact that my engineer was in Germany, he would do stuff and I'd be asleep, and then in the morning I'd have files, to check out, and then I could give him notes and then he could work on it. It kind of worked out in a way, and he did an awesome job. That's Robin Berner, and he also mixed another score that I have coming out. This movie should be dropping on the 24th. It was a week after this one. We did it recorded with the same group, basically just without banjo and fiddle. But like, we've kind of developed sort of a shorthand on dealing with stuff. But overall, despite it being internationally produced, I don't know if it would be much different if they were all in the same city.
Since this movie was so kind of heavy on the traditional orchestral roles, what was it like working with your orchestrator, and what is the process like for you of composing to then pass off to your orchestrator?
I generally I'm relatively orchestrated in the DAW. If there's some wiggle room on something, I'll tell them, there's occasionally I'll use, woodwind pads or patches that shorts or longs or something where I can say, he knows, like, all right, just orchestrate it however it is. It's just in a block or whatever.
Right.
That's fine. If I want something very specific on an instrument, I will put it on that instrument. But on this movie, it wasn't really a problem. He wasn't necessarily filling in the blanks. Obviously, he was filling in the blanks a little bit on certain things. So like, there's some really thick string writing that he was kind of, okay, what's the Divisi going to be? He's making choices that way. On Bunker, which is the other movie that's coming out, he did a lot more. This is Andrew Osano. He's a cello player as well, and has a lot more experience on string instruments than I do for that in that way. So there were things where I kind of relied on him on that specifically, like, okay, will this effect work? Or, hey, like, let's record. And I told him, like, if there's a cool effect, like, let's figure out where we can put it, and we'll just trust that it's going to be right. He did a really awesome job on both those projects. But normally I'm fairly orchestrated, right? Like, I have a classical composer background. I in the sense that, like, I understand all the ranges and stuff. I don't necessarily write in like short score, I guess. I know that some people will do that if they know that it's going to be live recorded. Like, why orchestrate it? Like, why orchestrate it out, right? Like, why synthestrate it? But I've personally found that to get some things approved, I kind of have to do the mock-up as best I can. It's hard. I try not to go to the producers or director and say, just trust me.
One of the things I really love about doing this show is just talking with people who are all kinds of different points in their careers. I've had an opportunity to speak with a lot of folks who are in early stages of their careers, and I'm sure we have all heard the various interviews with people like Hans Zimmer and stuff like that are so far off of most of us. But this like middle period of someone's career where they have like a really serious body of work behind them, and you can see the trajectory of their IMDb credits and their work. It's really fascinating to like reflect like in that moment. And it seems like this is like a big moment for you as a composer for this film. And I just wanted to understand, how you're feeling with this now under your belt and where you kind of see your career heading now that you've worked on this film.
Well, up, man. No, I'm just kidding. Well, no, I'm actually, I that's an interesting question. I think that my biggest reflection, I think, at this point is that I'm tremendously grateful that I had this thought recently. I was like, man, if I change jobs tomorrow, I've had a 12-year-long composer career, right? Which is a thing that when you start out, you're like, this is not ever going to happen. You know what I mean? Like it feels so insurmountable. You're scoring every little thing you can get your hands on. You're just like, just give me a shot, right? And to some extent, I kind of realized I didn't transition out of that thought process of like, oh, I just feel like I'm playing at this still.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I was doing this movie, I had this thought of like, oh, like I've been paying my bills for 12 years doing this job. I've been doing this job and it's providing for my family. It's providing for my life. This is my livelihood. If I changed careers and people asked, what did I do between this time and that time? I was like, well, I was a composer. I wrote music for a living for 12 years,
Yeah.
And I think something I've definitely been trying to be more on top of is just being grateful for the opportunity that I have had. And who knows what's gonna come next? It's tremendously. I guess I've been trying to transition my brain into being more grateful, and like I couldn't have imagined that I would be where I am now 12 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
If I would have told myself 12 years ago, hey, by the way, you're going to be paying all your bills and scoring multi-million-dollar movies, I wouldn't know what I would do with myself. You know what I mean? I am obviously optimistic and hopeful that the next thing that comes, and I'm in talks with people who are saying, yeah, it's coming. We're going to do another one. And I'm like, great, call me when you get
the old way too.
The old way too, even older ways. But, I think that's my general take on it. I feel like everything's going up, which is great. But generally, if I'm scoring Nicolas Cage movies or multi-million-dollar movies that play the theater, excellent, like amazing. I also had recently the opportunity to co-score on Disney's The Owl House, the animated series for the last season with Brad Breek, and that's been a tremendously cool experience to work at that scale, at that level, on that animation, on like the animation side of things, which was a lot of fun,
Yeah.
And I think that's generally my take, is that who knows where I'll be in another 10 years, I don't know. But I mean, I'm optimistic and hopeful that it'll be great no matter what.
I'm curious if you could go back to 12 years ago, Andrew, what piece of advice would you give him?
Oh man, I would say the two things I would definitely put out there. The first thing is my personal advice is the first thing is just to write every day. Definitely keep writing every day, learn your instrument, which is your writing setup, your computer. And the next thing really is, just expect a lot of ups and downs. And don't take everything personally, right? That's like kind of the big pull is like this job, if somebody doesn't respond to your email or your phone call or your text message, it's not because they hate you. Or it's not because you just may not have been right for the job at that moment. You may not have been right for something at that time, but who knows if that same that editor may remember you and then go on to another project. Oh, I know a perfect person for this, or even the director, or the producer, whoever. You just never know where people are going to end up, and so don't take anything too personally. Don't write emails angry. I've learned my lesson on that. I think that kind of all goes under don't take things too personally and just write every day. Those are the two things that I think if you're gonna do this job, you should really internalize, because there's a lot of ups and downs. There's a lot of rejection. There's a lot of stuff that you just got to deal with. So I think not taking any of it too personally, enjoy the fun while you have it.
I think that's solid advice. So for The Old Way, I believe that there is an album coming soon for the score. When is that coming out? When can people expect?
February 17th.
February 17th. So hopefully, like coinciding with this podcast releasing. People
there you go. There you go. February 17th. It should hit streaming platforms. And then the next week, also, there's going to be the Bunker score is also going to release. I'm pretty sure on the 24th.
Oh, awesome. We will definitely link to both of those. So before we wrap up, is there any other projects you have in the works right now or coming soon that maybe you could talk a little bit about?
Yeah, I mean, the Owl House's last episode will release in March, I think. I'm going to say that. I say that with a question mark. They've been releasing every 3 months, and I think that'll be 3 months since the last one. Hopefully they've announced that. I don't know when the official date is, but it'll be sometime in the next couple months, it's the final episode of their whole show, which was really fun to work on and score. And then Bunker is also releasing in theaters, limited theaters, so you have to see which ones it's at, but that's on the 24th of February. And those are kind of the big things that are going on in the next 2 months, which is, it's crazy that it's crazy when things are coming out, a couple months after you work on them and you're like, all right, cool. It's officially out in the world. It feels like it's actually done, even though I turned it in already,
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's been great talking to you, and please, listeners, go and watch The Old Way and listen to the album when it's out. I believe The Old Way is on streaming, on video on demand. It might still be in theaters by the time this comes out. For people to go and check out. It's been awesome talking to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Daniel.
It was great hearing from Andrew about his work. Please go take a listen to the soundtrack for The Old Way on streaming services available now, and watch the film on video on demand. Thanks for listening to The Scorekeepers. Scorekeepers is produced by Daniel Farrell Music and Sound, with graphic and visual design by Patrick Farrell. Scorekeepers is proudly hosted and recorded using Zencastr. Make sure you subscribe to hear new episodes of The Scorekeepers wherever you listen. And be sure to rate and review this episode to help us find new listeners. Thanks for listening.